When you hear the name James Madison, you probably think father of the Constitution, the brilliant mind, the architect of American government. But his presidency? Well, that wasn't about drawing up blueprints. It was about pure survival. It's a story about what happens when the architect is forced to lead his own creation through a firestorm he absolutely never saw coming.
And that's the real question here, isn't it? We all know he was a genius as a political thinker, but his presidency was defined by crisis, by war, by survival. His time in office would test all of his brilliant ideas in the most brutal, real-world way you can imagine. So let's back up. How does this political thinker end up as chief executive? Well, when Madison took office back in 1809, the expectations for him were just sky high. I mean, this wasn't just another politician. To many, he was the guy, the one who held the blueprint for America itself.
I mean, just look at this resume. It's incredible. A key architect of the Constitution, a co-author of the Federalist Papers, and he'd been Secretary of State right under Thomas Jefferson. With a track record like that, you can see why Americans felt like they were getting this incredibly experienced, thoughtful leader. But, no resume in the world could have prepared him for what was just around the corner.
Because that calm, intellectual world of political theory, that was about to get shattered by a massive international crisis. This conflict wasn't happening on paper. It was raging on the high seas, and it would come to define every single part of Madison's presidency.
At the very heart of this conflict was a practice called impressment. Now, to put it simply, this meant British warships were stopping American ships, grabbing American sailors, and forcing them to serve in the British Royal Navy, totally against their will.
And listen, this wasn't just some minor diplomatic issue. We are talking about thousands of American citizens being, for all intents and purposes, kidnapped on the open ocean. You can just imagine the absolute outrage this caused back home. It was seen as this huge violation of American sovereignty, a total slap in the face.
So all that outrage lit a political fire under Madison. There was this faction in Congress, they got the nickname the Warhawks, guys like a young Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, and they saw only one way out of this. They were demanding war. For them, it was about defending the nation's honor, protecting trade, and for some of them, it was also seen as a chance to maybe grab some territory up in Canada. And just like that, James Madison, the scholar, was pushed into the role of a wartime commander-in-chief. The War of 1812 kicked off, and it became the ultimate test, not just for Madison's leadership, but for the very survival of this young nation he had worked so hard to create.
Now, the war was a total roller coaster. It starts in 1812. In 1813, the U.S. actually pulls off some really key victories at sea, which was a huge morale boost. But then came the devastating blow in August of 1814, when British forces literally marched on Washington, D.C. and set the city on fire. The war finally came to an official end with a treaty that December. And that moment, that was the absolute low point. As the British burned the White House and the Capitol building, James Madison had to flee the city. Think about that for a second. It gives him this undoubtedly humiliating distinction. He is the only sitting American president to ever have to run from an enemy invasion.
But here's the thing, despite that personal humiliation, despite seeing his capital in flames, Madison's resolve didn't break. Not at all. He regrouped, he rallied what was left of his government, and he was absolutely determined to see the war through. He just refused to let that crisis be the final word.
So let's talk about the aftermath, because this is where things get really interesting. The end of the war wasn't a clear win or a clear loss for anyone. Instead, it left behind this really complicated legacy that ended up reshaping the United States in ways nobody could have predicted. And to really get it, you've got to look at both sides of the coin here. On one hand, the war really did forge a stronger, more confident nation. But on the other, it left behind some incredibly deep and painful scars. Okay, so on the plus side, the country saw this incredible surge of patriotism, which sometimes gets called the era of good feelings. Because British imports were cut off during the war, American manufacturing had to step up, and it started to grow. The U.S. also earned some real newfound respect on the world stage. And, maybe most importantly, it was a wake-up call that the country needed a stronger, more modern military. But the negatives were really serious. The war was super divisive, especially in New England. Some states up there were so angry they actually talked about leaving the Union. The war also exposed just how shockingly unprepared the U.S. military was at the beginning. It caused massive economic chaos, and
Tragically, it made conflicts with Native American tribes much worse, leading to the displacement of so many people. This crisis also forced Madison himself to change. For a long, long time, he had been dead set against the idea of a national bank. But the financial chaos of the wars showed him, and everyone else, that the country desperately needed some kind of economic stability. So, in what was a pretty stunning reversal, Madison signed the bill creating the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. He chose what was practical over his own long-held principles. So, where does that leave us with Madison's legacy? How do we square these two images of the same man? The brilliant architect on one side and the tested and, let's be honest, sometimes struggling wartime commander on the other.
When you boil it down, the expectation for his presidency could not have been more different from the reality. Everyone expected a presidency guided by ideas and theory. What they got was one defined by crises. He went into the White House as a brilliant thinker, and he came out a tested, resilient wartime leader. He inherited a fragile nation, and he left behind one that was, somehow, more confident in itself.
In the end, Madison's time in office really offers this powerful lesson about what leadership is. It proves that having the perfect blueprint, having all the right ideas, well, that's not enough. Real leadership is about resilience. It's about adapting. It's about being able to steer the ship right through the middle of the storm, even if it means you have to flee your own burning capital to do it.
And that really leaves us with one last thing to think about. When you look at James Madison, did the crisis of the War of 1812 actually make him the leader he became? Or did it just reveal the tough, pragmatic survivor that was there all along, hiding right under the surface of the scholar?